So thank you for joining us. And first of all, they may have told you, but I just want to say it again, that I can see you below me, but for you to see me, I'm above you. So if it looks a little strange, please forgive me.
I'm used to Zoom. We're all used to it.
Unfortunately, yes. So you've just returned from the G7 and the ASEAN international meetings. Clearly, the war in Ukraine has been top of the agenda. Amid the conflict, which are the most important relationships for Canada and the G7 right now, the ones that are worth nurturing the most?
Well, I think the way we engage in partnership with the Global South is hugely important. I mean, the G20 has representatives from every corner of the world, and the significant players in the Global South, whether it was African leaders or South American leaders, or even a range of the Asian leaders that I also met with while we were over there for a number of summits, are going to be essential partners. I mean, they are all affected by the impact of the food insecurity crisis, the energy challenges related to Russia's illegal invasion. But we can't just push at them on that. We have to be there as partners. We have to be there as investors. We have to be there as reliable, engaged interlocutors, not just around development or humanitarian aid, but around economic investments that are going to make a difference. And that those ties of highlighting that even though many of them are loath to full-on pick a side as they see it, they also know that what Russia's done and the kinds of challenges that authoritarian states are putting forward means that engaging constructively and reliably with us as interlocutors is really important.
So you obviously raised the relationship with Russia. It is at its lowest ebb in more than 30 years, one can say. Can it have, this relationship, any chance of improving as long as President Putin is in power?
I think that's the wrong frame for the question. I think the way we have to be anchored in our approach to this war is to say that it's not just Ukraine under threat, but it's the very values that underpin our democracies, our rules-based order, our secure and open world. And therefore, until Russia sees that it cannot and must not be able to benefit from disrupting that prosperity and stability that has come with peace and order over the past 7 or so decades, there is no place for Russia as a constructive partner to anyone. And what we're focused on now is very much ensuring that our economies, our open, free economies, don't rely on authoritarian leaders like Vladimir Putin for necessary inputs into our citizens' well-beings. And that's a shift that Europe saw very clearly in its reliance on oil, Russian oil and gas, that it's quickly trying to get off. But all of us need to look around the world at our supply chains and say, okay, if we can't rely on Russia, if we can't rely on authoritarian countries that use their providing of cheap resources as a economic and political lever against our democracies, how can we build more reliable supply chains? And that's where Canada on energy, on critical minerals, is very focused on stepping up.
So just on this last point, clearly, as you say, energy security is top of the agenda. Can you give us details on what role Canada can play in satisfying the increased demand for natural gas from elsewhere?
Well, certainly in the short term, we know we can help by injecting more oil and gas into global markets, and that's what we're doing. But we see that Europe and other places don't just want to get off Russian oil and gas. They want to try and move beyond oil and gas altogether, as we all do, as we look to decarbonize. And that's where Canada can be an extraordinarily reliable supplier of energy clean energy in a net zero world. That's where we're moving towards hydrogen. That's where we're going so aggressively on carbon capture, use and storage to make sure that natural gas can be used in a way that doesn't contribute to climate change. There are massive innovations we're investing in at the same time as we're looking at all the critical minerals, whether it's lithium or cobalt or nickel or others that Canada has that the world needs, that we can be providing to the world that is going to rely on those as we move into a higher tech and cleaner future.
So as you say, Canada is pitching itself as a reliable supplier of key materials, for example, in the EV supply chain, and in part to replace China. So how real, and it sounds like you think it's very real, is friend-shoring, and how is it playing out? And what is the world therefore going to look like in, say, 3 to 5 years?
For me, it's not about friends. It's about shared values and responsibilities. Rather than saying to a given partner in the world, oh, you should really buy things from Canada because we're nice to you and we're friendly, what we're saying is, no, you should demand that your companies source lithium or energy from countries that have high environmental standards, that have from countries that respect labor rights, from countries that respect human rights, that's the bar we should hit. And of course, those countries happen to be friends. But if it actually encourages other countries to realize, okay, we cannot continue to sell our natural resources unless we clean up our environmental approach, unless we start paying people decent wages, unless we stop the human rights abuses, that puts pressure on the world to get better in a way that isn't as exclusive as, oh, we'll just trade with our friends. So I think friend-shoring is a useful shorthand for all that. But the issue we have and what we have is to say, listen, friendliness shouldn't come into the cold, hard calculations around what economic interest is. It should be, are they doing the right thing for the planet? Are they doing the right thing for the long term? Are they respecting their citizens? Because that's not just about building a better future. It's also an indicator of internal stability and prosperity in a country that actually gives everyone a real and fair chance to succeed.
I'm going to come back to this, but I do just want to go take one step back to the Ukraine conflict, and because of course, you have said that Canada is going to stand by Ukraine until the very end. You've provided money, weapons, and other supplies, and I believe you're even selling a bond to raise money. So what are your red lines for arms being used? So for example, would you feel comfortable for Ukraine to use Canadian weapons, let's say, in Crimea?
We work with all our allies. It's not about any individual country, although we all share similar red lines. It's an issue around making sure that we are showing clearly that Ukraine can and must win in this conflict, that Russia needs to understand that there is no path forward for them on this, and that we get to stand up for our principles, our values. And yes, as you point out, it's a difficult time with inflation and energy shortages and energy and food shortages and fertilizer shortages around the world because of Russia's illegal invasion. But at the same time, when you point out that Canada emitted a Ukraine bond, it's been fully subscribed, which points out how Canadians themselves know that we need to stand with Ukraine in absolutely reliable ways. And we're going to continue to, as you said, as long as it takes.
So this week, Canada has outlined its new Indo-Pacific strategy. And of course, all these themes sort of tie into each other, right? But basically, to counter Chinese influence, what is the single biggest goal? And of course, you've spoken a lot, but what is the single biggest goal of this strategy? And how long will it take to materialize?
First of all, it's a recognition that Canada has always been a Pacific country. We have deep and long-standing ties across the Pacific to a range of Asian countries and economies. But with the global center of economic gravity shifting more clearly towards Asia over the past years, we know we have to be even more present and engaged. And that's where investing in deeper trade ties, investing in more infrastructure and partnerships, investing in stronger diplomatic presence, and showing that we are that steady partner that Asia needs and is interested in. And it goes on many levels. First of all, yes, our resources, alternatives for critical minerals, energy resources that people have always looked to Canada for. But increasing, when I was there, I really heard a lot of interest in, wow, Canada's a leader in AI. Canada's got extraordinary high-tech manufacturing. Canada's the G7 country with the fastest growing population, the most open to immigration, the most diverse population. These are the things that are very, very interesting to companies looking to get a foothold in North America, looking to create those ties with a country that remains the only G7 country with a free trade deal with every other G7 country. So as we look to global trade, Canada is well positioned at the center of everything.
We're talking about Asia, and we've seen extraordinary protests on the streets of China in recent days. They seem mainly targeted at COVID and the lockdown restrictions, but of course, some are being directly focused and targeted at President Xi and the Communist Party. What is your take on what is happening in China and on the Chinese government's response?
Canada, as you know, has a very, very large Chinese-Canadian community, and we have had long ties across the Pacific to China and other countries, and it means we're watching very, very closely. Obviously, it's really important that citizens be able to make themselves heard, that they're protesting, yes, on a specific issue that touches on so many others of government control, of authoritarian states. We, of course, stand with those protesters. We know how important it is for people to express themselves, for journalists to be able to do their jobs. And we're going to continue to consistently stand up for human rights and the things that people in China and people all around the world are continuing to fight for.
So there was disagreement between you and President Xi at the G20 in Bali. And President Xi's rebuke was quite remarkable. Have you patched things up?
Canada is always going to stand up very clearly for our values. These are the types of conversations that one has at these summits all the time, where we make very, very clear what Canada's positions are. We look to do it in a constructive way, but we won't back down from being a country that stands up for the rule of law, that stands up for the rights of citizens, and that will always be there to promote Canadian interests and values on the world stage. And not everyone likes that, but not every conversation gets to be an easy one. When we're direct about where we stand, I think it's important to be able to be clear on that.
Do you think China is the biggest threat to global stability?
I think there are many challenges we're facing as a world, and they all interweave in multiple ways. And that's where the Canadian government and Canadians need to remain consistent in our values, in our approach, work closely and align with people who share our values, look to challenge others like China where we need to, look to cooperate when it's in our interest to do so, but be very, very open-eyed about the various challenges we're facing around the world.
I'm just going to press you on this issue a little bit more, which is, where do you think that the West's relationship is vis-a-vis China right now?
I think there are various degrees of engagement across the West. There's not one single approach, but there is a consistency in understanding that China is an increasingly important global economic power, but it's also an increasingly challenging or disruptive global economic power. And we have to be thoughtful about how we engage in commercial and economic ties that benefit our citizens and can create growth that benefits everyone, while at the same time being consistent that we're going to stand up for our values, for our principles, for the things that our citizens in the West expect us to stand for, not just for our own purposes, but to highlight to people in China who disagree with the regime that there are other ways of doing things and there is a better future possibly ahead.
So, of course, we've not only had the G20 and ASEAN, we've had the COP just most recently. And Canada has committed to cutting emissions 40 to 45% below current levels by 2030. But, of course, the oil and gas sector continues to grow in terms of production, in terms of emission. So how does your government square Canada's being a major oil producer and your climate promises?
Well, that's been the question for the past 7 years that we've been in government. Canada is one of the top oil and gas producers in the world, and yet over the past 7 years, we've become one of the strongest voices around the world on fighting climate change, including by bringing in one of the strongest broad-based prices on pollution that any country has. And 7 years in, we're really seeing that it's starting to have all those positive impacts. I mean, for example, I just sat down a few months ago with one of our top steel producers in this country, an ArcelorMittal factory in Dofasco, that is making its transition away from coal burning to electric arc because Canada's grid is 80% clean already, and the market for green steel is climbing rapidly around the world, and it just makes good business sense. But it was also hundreds of millions of dollars in penalties because of the carbon price that they were going to be paying by 2030 if they continued. So we've demonstrated that by putting a price on pollution, by returning it, much of it, to the pockets of hardworking Canadians in a way that leaves them better off, we're both demonstrating the ability to pivot and hit those targets while building an economy that's going to prosper not just for the coming years, but for the coming decades.
We just have a couple minutes left, but of course, the U.S. presidential elections are still 2 years away, but they do loom large after these recent midterms. How concerned are you that America First protectionism will be on the agenda again?
I think, there's... the reality is the U.S. Will continue to have these debates. Our approach is going to consistently be, like it was during the previous administration, to demonstrate that the Canadian and U.S. economies are so seamlessly integrated in so many ways that protectionism against Canadian investors or Canadian companies actually ends up hurting U.S. companies and U.S. workers in significant ways. That's the argument we use to successfully renegotiate our NAFTA deal with Donald Trump. That's the argument we continue to put forward when the current administration was talking about made in U.S. Battery supply chains for electric vehicles. We pointed out that it needed to be made in North America, and they made that change. And we now have developed a supply chain on electric vehicles and batteries that goes from the raw materials to assembling them into batteries in cars and then recycling them as well. I mean, we've been recently noted to be the second strongest battery supply chain in the world, just after China, ahead of all the others. And that's because we've been making those investments in the Canadian expertise, the Canadian resource, the Canadian workers, the Canadian supply chain as a reliable partner to the world. And that kind of frame is what the U.S., regardless of who the U.S. president is going to need to rely on. And that's what the world's going to be looking to Canada for, and we are extremely well positioned to benefit from that.
So last question for you, and I'm going to ask for a little introspection here. One of the big themes of our conference here today and over the next 48 hours at Reuters Next is leadership, and leadership in turbulent times. What is your best leadership quality?
An ability to gather around me extraordinary people who want to serve the country with a range of different perspectives and and approaches. Because a country as diverse as Canada needs to be able to meet people where they are and reassure them where they are. And the big thing we focused on, whether it was during the pandemic or whether it's in the fight against climate change, was reassuring Canadians about the fact that their institutions were there to hear them, to understand them, and to deliver for them. We came out of the pandemic with a stronger fiscal position than just about any other of our peer countries because we did the right investments to be there for small businesses, for families, for workers. We knew that investing in Canadians, giving them confidence in the competence of their institutions was the guarantee that we were going to be able to get through this. And that approach, by having an extraordinary team of people around me to deliver that, has made a huge impact in where Canada can look with optimism through the troubled waters ahead to a future in which it is very, very bright for Canada and Canadians, and we're looking forward to contribute to the world that way.
Prime Minister Trudeau, thank you so much for joining us at Reuters Next this morning.
Real pleasure, Alessandra. Thank you very much.